I'm going to run through the synthesis of synthesis report Circular Harbors. This is the version that you also see on the screen. I will quickly go through, not to explain everything, but to give a kind of context. The introductory text is actually what Walter already described, but maybe it's interesting to clarify to you all where we started. There was a work done on the Merwe Vierhaven, one of the districts in the Rotterdam city or port and Rotterdam city as well, in the framework of a trajectory last year, where the question was, the ambition from the port of Rotterdam and the city of Rotterdam is clear in terms of words, namely this should be the incubator of the making economy, the productive economy, which should be circular because it's the economy of the future, and to make sure that the port, the regional economy of Rotterdam makes that transition from the current economy to a circular economy, we need to offer space to new initiatives. So far, the words in ambition strategy documents of both city and port, of the city port, the Stadshavens, which is the cooperation that exists in Rotterdam for certain areas of the ports. The question was given, and there both Architecture Workroom and 1010 Architecture Urbanism were involved to, 1010 was the lead designer, to explore by interviewing all kinds of innovative practices, companies, stakeholders of the bigger economy and the smaller initiatives, what would you actually need in terms of space? And one of the explorations actually led to an alternative development plan, because also this area was an area where the logic of port out, city in is, let's say, floating still above the future of this area. It is much more easy to sell industrial lands to housing. It would make more profit for the owners of the land, more profit for the developers of that land, but the space for economic activity would no longer exist for good, because it's very hard to return from housing to industry or to port activity. So the waterfront development is still a little bit in the books, literally the calculations of the profit the city of Rotterdam wants to get out of this area, while the ambitions are to stimulate the economy. And that tension became a broader conversation with an invitation to all kinds of other initiatives in July of 2008 in Rotterdam. A conversation made clear that many ports are actually convinced that they need to think completely different about the use of space, not as something that can be simply given out to new types of activities, whatever they are, as long as they create jobs. But if we want to make the transition towards a circular economy, it requires a completely different idea of how we develop that space, which types of infrastructures are needed, infrastructures going from tubes, making sure that the new circular materials or goods and not the non-fossil goods can flow, new water management, small scale places that can actually allow companies to grow, maybe also common installations, such as should every company have a robot arm, or should we actually collectively develop a robot arm, to give a little example, it's the little examples, or a material bank, because only then we can move forward. Then I cut things short. Due to the conversations we had, two things happened at the same time. We launched around this subject and many other subjects a Delta Atelier, a platform that tries to be a free haven for pooling the knowledge that everybody has, but especially also the questions many people have. From that pooling of the knowledge, make the next step, see what the next step in terms of knowledge development and so on could be, leading towards implementation. That happens in many fields now in the Delta Atelier. It's a non-profit platform to pool knowledge. It's supported by the Dutch and the Flemish government as this new peer-to-peer platform. One of the trajectories on the circular city ports is continuing, both between the Dutch and the Flemish government. There is an exploration going towards a circular mainframe. So what would be the circular mainframe of this Delta, enabling to exchange carbon, oxygen, hydrogen with one another in port areas, but maybe also between port areas or industrial clusters and port areas. But at the same time, the conversation of July 2008 was picked up further and looking into which strategies, spatial strategies, new coalitions, new agreements between different stakeholders were made to advance this circular economy, not in strategy documents, but in practice. So looking at how it happens in the field. And you see to the right what the document, the synthesis document actually is a synthesis of, namely a study of these 11 port areas, both seaports and inland ports, trying to understand which initiatives they are having or starting up or finished, which ones they are thinking of, where they are hitting boundaries, to understand where we stand in terms of the practice of this transition to circular economy in each of these fields. That led to beautiful walls with all kinds of fiches, a beautiful word that cannot be translated into English, so we educate every session to understand that word since then. Fiches is an attempt to indicate on which subject matter the circular initiative tries to work, what it tries to link to one another, which stakeholders are involved, and what the envisioned effect or measurable effect would be. That last is very difficult. But then through the working sessions we had, there were actually also some conclusions, because we had 2 working sessions, actually 3 working sessions before this one in Rotterdam in July, and then after that this year, we had 2 working sessions to actually bring together the knowledge, the opinions from port authorities, regional authorities or city authorities, employers unions, the SERF in Flanders, Dutch, French, and all kinds of other Brussels examples, how they are thinking about the future of the port. But we also see some common elements, and these common elements are in fact what is either under you, literally, but especially also under this session. It's the starting point or the departing platform under this session. And I will quickly run through. We need a common notion on what circularity exactly is. That's what we wrote some months ago. I think today we will say it's impossible to answer that question. But it's quite clear that under circularity, we understand many, many things. And there's always, in this synthesis report, a document trying to clarify what it could be and to broaden the scope of what it is. I will not explain. Second, it's impossible to think of circular economy initiatives without only as spatial initiatives or urban projects or as collaborations between companies. It also entails rethinking what a port authority is. The landlord port authority, on the one hand, needs to evolve into something else. We will hear more about that later, because today it's not really a task in the mission of the port authorities to implement circular economy. Is not immediately the first thing that is in the documents. Criteria for concessions is one. To build up a system of circularity, you need to separate different ecosystems of actors. It's something that cannot be implemented top-down by governmental decision. From now on we are circular. And neither does one party or actor be circular alone. It is something that you do in a network, a chain, literally, an economic chain you could say, but also a chain of materials, of actors working together. For the current obstacle, the sharing of data, needs to be overcome. To be able to form these chains of actors, you need knowledge on what they have and what they need, what they have on offer and what they need. And that's something on which many ports are working. The material flows of Rotterdam on the top, the Toile Industrielle in Declerck at the bottom. An attempt to structure knowledge about the flows of material, of goods, that different companies could start to exchange with one another. They do not exchange because we know it, but if we don't know it, we cannot even start discussing what to exchange with one another. 5, significant shift in the regulatory framework is crucial in order to facilitate circularity. Many of these initiatives hit the boundaries of what is feasible and possible. We need to provide a framework for these new technologies. There, in the port of Rotterdam, for example, it was often the environmental rules and regulations, distances, protection measures, which inhibited the combination of functions necessary for circular initiatives. 6, the programming of infrastructure is essential to support the further development of circularity in city ports, where we talk about, one of the examples we will see today, where we think of different scales of transport, different modes of transport necessary to make sure that these exchanges can happen. And 7, to have a port which functions more circular, differentiated spaces are needed and should be preserved. That's a part on which we developed much further for today. Nadia will explain all of that in a moment, where we see that different types of spaces should be made. It's neither the port where you cannot drink a coffee, it's neither the city where there's no space for industrial activity. You see a differentiated set of new types of spaces emerging, and we see that in the examples we through the fishes mapped, but we also see it as something that could be further developed towards the future. This transition towards more circularity cannot be tackled alone. Coalitions need to be promoted in order to strategize upon this change. One thing we see everywhere, from the smallest scale of one site in a port area, is that it's a cooperation between actors, but also in a broader environment, it works through agreements to new types of coalitions between actors. To end with what Walter already said, looking at the city port, and city you could place between brackets. It's maybe important to clarify. If we say city port, it doesn't mean it's something else than a seaport. We are in a delta, and in fact that's the way we read it. All of our ports have started in cities, in urban environments. It's the growth of these cities that went together with the growth of these ports. The last decades, the growth of these ports meant taking distance from cities mostly, and we see that the circular ports also try to explore new relations with their urban environments, such as here in M4H++++, and the pluses stand for how this area should not be an island of port activity, but could connect to all kinds of other environments. So far, a quick introduction into where we came from. These working sessions brought together the practices that already exist, brought us to a kind of common understanding of what we see under the question we face collectively. And we also started learning more through the initiatives that are taken about where we can work in which way on the transition towards circular economy. Because you don't work in the same way in the fringes, let's say in old urban ports, as you do in the Maasvlakte in the port of Rotterdam. They are all needed to make the transition towards a circular port, but not one is sufficient. This session, you also found on your chair the program for today. The program for today consists of looking at some of these practices more in detail. And the reason for this is that we explicitly try to see this session as thinking from the practice of doing things in the field. What is it that would inhibit you to move further or help you to accelerate and make the next steps? Many of the initiatives that will be on the table, first on the screen and then on the table today, are initiatives that are very ambitious if you look at them as one world in themselves, and at the same time stand in the framework of a much bigger port activity that is there. Therefore, the work that you will see today is work on the building blocks. So it's an attempt to structure where we could act and what logics could be, strategies could be to make space, literally, for circular coalitions and initiatives, circular chains. That work is reflecting some of the initiatives that are here in the room, and through this we would like to think of what is needed, because that's what Walter already explained. The goal of these sessions is to explore where we are, to understand what we are doing already, but also to think collectively about what the next steps would need to be in order to make sure we reach the ambitions we set. In the Netherlands, the ambitions are extremely clear: 100% circular economy in 2050. In Belgium, these ambitions are less clear. It's a typical cultural difference between these two parts of one similar delta. But at the same time, there's also many initiatives. So if we need to learn from what you are doing in practice, what would be the method to actually make it happen in a next step?